When my ex-husband Marcus walked into that courtroom wearing his $1,000 suit and that smug smile I knew so well, demanding half of everything I'd built from nothing, I almost laughed out loud. Almost. Because sitting in my purse was a document he'd signed without reading 7 years ago, too busy flirting with our wedding planner to pay attention to the fine print. What happened next didn't just save my business empire, it exposed a web of lies that made me question everything I thought I knew about the man I'd once loved. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Martha Rodriguez. I'm 42 years old, and yesterday I watched my ex-husband's face crumble when I handed our judge a prenuptial agreement that he swore didn't exist. But let me start from the beginning. Because this story isn't just about a divorce. It's about discovering that sometimes the people closest to us are the ones hiding the darkest secret. I built Rodriguez Digital Marketing from my kitchen table 8 years ago with nothing but a laptop, $300, and the kind of desperate determination that only comes from having nowhere else to go. Marcus thought it was cute back then. My little hobby business. Something to keep me busy while he climbed the corporate ladder at his father's real estate firm. He'd pat my head and say things like, "That's nice, honey," when I'd tell him about landing a new client or developing a campaign strategy that actually worked. What wasn't cute to him was when my little hobby started generating 6 figures, then 7, then 8. Suddenly my kitchen table operation had moved into a downtown office space with 12 employees, and Marcus wasn't patting my head anymore. He was asking questions, lots of questions, about revenue streams and profit margins, and whether I really needed that expensive new software suite, the kind of questions that made my stomach twist because they weren't coming from a place of support, they were coming from a place of ownership. The first red flag should have been when he started referring to it as our business at dinner parties. The second should have been when he suggested I add him to the corporate accounts just in case something happened. The third, fourth and fifth red flags were probably when he began showing up at my office unannounced, charming my employees with his easy smile and expensive cologne, asking casual questions about client contracts and upcoming projects. But I was in love. Or thought I was. And love makes you stupid in ways that intelligence can't fix. I thought his interest meant he finally understood how important this was to me. I thought his questions meant he was proud of what I'd accomplished. I thought his suggestions about joint accounts and shared responsibilities meant he wanted to be my partner in everything, not just marriage. I was wrong about a lot of things back then, but I was right about one thing that would save everything I'd worked for. I was right to insist on that prenuptial agreement. Marcus had fought me on it initially, said it wasn't romantic, said it meant I didn't trust him, said his family would think I was being cold and calculating. His mother, Patricia Westbrook, with her perfectly highlighted hair and her perfectly passive-aggressive comments, had pulled me aside at our engagement party and said, "Darling, successful marriages are built on trust, not legal documents." She'd smiled when she said it, but her eyes were ice cold, and I knew she'd been the one whispering in Marcus's ear about how insulting the whole thing was. But I'd learned from watching my own mother lose everything in her divorce when I was 16. I'd seen how quickly what's yours is mine became what's mine is definitely mine, and what's yours is also mine when lawyers got involved. So I stood my ground, even when Marcus sulked for 3 weeks and threatened to call off the wedding. Even when his father, Richard Westbrook, took me out to lunch and spent 2 hours explaining how their family had always believed in the sanctity of traditional marriage, where spouses shared everything equally. The irony, looking back, is that Marcus only agreed to sign the prenup because his wedding planner, a stunning blonde named Savannah with legs that went on for miles and a laugh that sounded like wind chimes, was sitting right there in our lawyer's office the day we went to review the document. Marcus spent the entire meeting flirting with her, asking about flower arrangements and reception music, barely glancing at the legal papers our attorney, David Chen, was explaining in detail. "It's pretty standard stuff," David had said, sliding the document across the mahogany table. "Separate property remains separate, including any businesses owned prior to marriage or developed independently during the marriage. No claims on individual assets acquired through personal investment or labor, and in the event of dissolution, each party retains what they brought into the union, plus what they've independently accumulated. Marcus nodded absently, his attention focused on Savannah's explanation of centerpiece options. Yeah, whatever, that's fine, he'd said, scrawling his signature across the bottom without reading a single paragraph. Savannah, tell me more about those imported roses you mentioned. I should have been insulted that he was more interested in flowers than our future financial arrangements, but honestly I was just relieved he'd signed. David had given me a look across the table, raised eyebrows, slight shake of the head, like he couldn't believe what he'd just witnessed. Even our lawyer knew this was going to matter someday, and it did matter. 7 years later, when Marcus packed his bags and moved in with his secretary, Jessica, a 26-year-old with an MBA and apparently no moral compass, it mattered more than anything else in the world. The divorce proceedings started ugly and got worse. Marcus hired Thompson, Klein and Associates, the most aggressive family law firm in the city, the kind of lawyers who charged $800 an hour and earned every penny by destroying people's lives with surgical precision. His lead attorney, Caroline Thompson, was a shark in designer heels who'd built her reputation on getting massive settlements for her clients, regardless of what they actually deserved. Their opening move was to demand 50% of Rodriguez's digital marketing, claiming that as my spouse, Marcus had contributed to the company's growth and success through his support, advice, and indirect financial contribution. They argued that our marriage was a partnership in every sense of the word, and that community property laws entitled him to half of everything I'd built during our time together. The paperwork they filed was 37 pages of legal warfare, complete with financial projections showing what Marcus's share would be worth, nearly $4 million. They'd clearly done their homework, documenting every major contract I'd signed, every expansion I'd made, every hire I'd completed during our marriage. They painted a picture of a devoted husband who'd sacrificed his own career ambitions to support his wife's entrepreneurial dreams, a man who deserved to be compensated for his contributions to what they called the family business. It was complete fiction, but it was well-crafted fiction backed by expensive lawyers who knew how to make fiction sound like fact. My attorney, Elena Vasquez, was brilliant but practical. She'd warned me from the beginning that even with a prenup, divorce battles could get complicated, especially when significant assets were involved. He's going to fight this, she'd said during our first consultation. Men like Marcus don't just walk away from millions of dollars, even when they have no legal right to claim them. But Elena hadn't seen the prenup yet. I'd been saving that particular piece of ammunition, waiting for the right moment to deploy it. I wanted Marcus to commit fully to his narrative, to let his lawyers file their ridiculous demands and make their absurd arguments, before I revealed exactly how little legal ground they were standing on. The preliminary hearings were theater, pure and simple. Marcus showed up looking wounded and betrayed, playing the role of the devoted husband who'd been blindsided by his wife's greed and ambition. He testified about how he'd encouraged my business from the beginning, how he'd given me emotional support during difficult times, how he'd even suggested several marketing strategies that had proven successful. That last part made me want to scream. The marketing strategies he was claiming credit for had come from my own research and experience, ideas I'd developed and implemented entirely on my own. But Marcus had a way of inserting himself into conversations and then later remembering those conversations as though he'd been the one driving them. He'd done it throughout our marriage, subtly taking credit for my insights and suggestions, and now he was doing it under oath in a courtroom. His mother testified too, describing Marcus as a selfless partner who'd always put our marriage first, even when it meant making personal sacrifices for the sake of my career. She spoke about family dinners where Marcus would talk about their business, and how proud he was of what they had accomplished together. She was convincing, I had to admit. If I hadn't lived through the actual experience, I might have believed her version of events myself. The judge, the Honorable Rebecca Walsh, listened to everything with the kind of patience that comes from decades of hearing people lie about their marriage. She was in her 50s, with silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing, and I could tell she'd seen this exact scenario played out countless times before. Wealthy spouse builds something valuable, other spouse tries to claim half of it in divorce. Everyone pretends their motives are pure and their love was real. After 3 days of testimony and legal arguments, Judge Walsh called for a recess to review the financial documents, and consider both parties' claims. That's when Elena finally asked the question I'd been waiting for. Martha, she said, preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. You mentioned a prenuptial agreement during our initial consultation, but I haven't seen it in the discovery materials. Do you have a copy of that document? I smiled for the first time in weeks. I do, I said, pulling the manila envelope from my purse. I've been waiting for the right moment to introduce it into evidence. Elena's eyes widened as she read through the document, and I watched her expression change from professional interest to outright amazement. This is ironclad, she said finally. There's no ambiguity here at all. Your business assets are explicitly protected, and there's a specific clause about intellectual property and independent ventures. How did you get him to agree to terms this favorable? He never read it, I said simply. He was too busy flirting with our wedding planner to pay attention to what he was signing. Elena laughed, the kind of sharp, delighted laugh that lawyers get when they realize they're holding a winning hand. Well, she said, this changes everything. We need to file this immediately and request an emergency hearing. Once Judge Walsh sees this document, this case is over. But as Elena prepared the paperwork to introduce the prenup into evidence, something nagged at me. Marcus had been so confident throughout the proceedings, so sure of himself and his legal position, even with expensive lawyers, even with his family's resources. It seemed strange that he'd be fighting this hard for something he had no legitimate claim to, unless he thought he had an ace up his sleeve that I didn't know about. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Marcus's testimony, about the way he'd described our marriage and his role in my business. There were details in his story that I didn't remember, conversations he claimed we'd had that felt foreign to me. At first I'd assumed he was just lying, creating fiction to support his legal case. But what if it wasn't fiction? What if there were parts of our marriage that I'd forgotten or never fully understood? I got up at 3 a.m. and started going through old files, looking for anything that might explain Marcus's confidence. Bank statements, tax returns, business and corporation documents, insurance policies, anything that might reveal some legal connection between him and my company that I'd overlooked. What I found in a box of old paperwork made my blood run cold. Hidden behind our joint tax returns from 5 years ago was a document I'd never seen before, a limited partnership agreement that listed Marcus as a 25% silent partner in Rodriguez Digital Marketing. The signature at the bottom looked like mine, but something about it felt wrong. The handwriting was close but not quite right. The way my name was formed slightly different from how I usually sign documents. My hands were shaking as I compared the signature to other paperwork from the same time period. On our mortgage documents, signed just weeks apart, my signature looked completely different, more natural, more fluid. The partnership agreement signature looked forced, deliberate, like someone had been trying very carefully to replicate my handwriting. I stared at that document for 20 minutes, my mind racing through the implications. If this partnership agreement was legitimate, it would complicate everything. Even with the prenup, a formal business partnership would create legal obligations and profit-sharing requirements that could override the marriage contract. Marcus would have a legitimate claim to a portion of my company. But if the document was forged, if Marcus had somehow created this paperwork and hidden it among our files, then this wasn't just a divorce anymore. This was fraud. I called Elena at 6 a.m, too anxious to wait for normal business hour. She answered on the second ring, sounding alert, despite the early hour. I found something, I said without preamble, and I think Marcus has been planning this for a lot longer than we realize. Elena met me at her office 2 hours later, and I watched her examine the partnership agreement with the same careful attention she'd given the prenup. She compared signatures, checked dates, and pulled out a magnifying glass to examine the paper quality and ink pattern. "This is good work," she said finally. "If I didn't know better, I might believe this was legitimate, but there are several problems with it. First, the signature doesn't match your established pattern. Second, the document wasn't filed with the state as required for limited partnership. Third, and most importantly, there's no record of Marcus making any financial investment in your company, which would be required for this type of partnership arrangement. So it's fake. It's fake, Elena confirmed. But it's sophisticated. This isn't something Marcus could have created himself. He had professional help, probably from someone with legal document experience and access to high-quality materials. We're talking about someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The implications hit me like a freight train. Marcus hadn't just decided to go after my business during the divorce. He'd been planning this for years, creating false documentation that he could use as leverage when the time came. This wasn't the impulsive action of a bitter ex-husband. This was a calculated, long-term scheme to steal everything I'd worked for. We need to call the police, I said. Elena nodded grimly. We do, but first, we need to figure out who helped him create this document, because whoever it was, they're probably planning to testify that this partnership agreement is legitimate. We need to be prepared for that. As we sat in Elena's office that morning, going through every detail of the forged document, I realized that my marriage hadn't just failed. It had been a lie from the very beginning. Marcus hadn't married me because he loved me. He'd married me because he saw an opportunity. My business was starting to show real potential when we got engaged, and he'd positioned himself to take advantage of that success when the time was right. The prenup that I thought had protected me was just one layer of the plan. Marcus had agreed to sign it because he knew he was already creating an alternative path to my assets. The partnership agreement was his insurance policy, his way of claiming a piece of my company, regardless of what our marriage contract said. But he'd made one crucial mistake. He'd assumed I would never look closely enough at the documentation to notice the forgery. He'd counted on me being too trusting, too focused on the divorce proceedings to dig deeper into the financial paperwork. He'd underestimated me in the same way he'd always underestimated me, by assuming I was less intelligent and less determined than I actually was. As Elena and I prepared our counter strategy, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not just hope that I would keep my business, but hope that the truth would finally come out. Hope that Marcus would face real consequences for what he'd done. Hope that justice might actually prevail. Because tomorrow, when we walked back into that courtroom, we weren't just going to present a prenuptial agreement. We were going to expose a criminal conspiracy that had been years in the making. And Marcus, with his expensive lawyers and his confident smile, had absolutely no idea what was coming. The emergency hearing was scheduled for the next afternoon, and Elena spent the morning preparing our presentation. She'd contacted a handwriting expert and a document authentication specialist, both of whom would testify about the forged partnership agreement. She'd also subpoenaed financial records from Marcus's accounts, looking for payments that might lead us to whoever had helped him create the false documentation. What she found was even more damaging than we'd hoped. 3 payments of $5,000 each had been made from Marcus's personal account to something called Legal Document Services, a company that, upon further investigation, turned out to be a front for creating fraudulent paperwork. The owner, a disbarred attorney named Kevin Walsh, had a history of helping people forge legal documents for insurance fraud and asset protection schemes. But the most shocking discovery came when Elena traced the IP address of the computer used to create the partnership agreement. The document had been generated from Marcus's office computer at Westbrook Real Estate, the family business where he'd worked for the past decade. More than that, the creation date on the digital file showed that the document had been made just 2 weeks after our wedding. Marcus hadn't created this as a backup plan during our divorce. He'd created it during our honeymoon, while I was falling asleep in his arms in that luxury hotel in Hawaii, while I was talking about our future together and how excited I was to build a life with him. He was already planning to steal everything I owned. The partnership agreement wasn't just fraud, it was premeditated fraud, created within days of our marriage vows. I sat in Elena's office, staring at the computer timestamps and payment records, feeling like my entire understanding of reality was crumbling. The man I'd loved, the man I'd trusted with my heart and my future, had been systematically planning my financial destruction from the moment we'd said I do. There's more, Elena said gently. The investigation into Legal Document Services, revealed that Marcus wasn't their only client. Kevin Walsh has been creating fraudulent business documents for multiple members of the Westbrook family over the years. This appears to be a pattern of behavior, not a one-time incident. She showed me a list of Walsh's clients that read like a who's who of Marcus's relatives. His father Richard had commissioned fake partnership agreements for 2 different real estate ventures. His brother David had created false investment documents to inflate his net worth for loan applications. His cousin Michael had forged construction contracts to avoid paying subcontractors on a development project. The Westbrook family wasn't just wealthy. They were wealthy criminals who'd built their fortune on a foundation of lies and stolen assets. And Marcus had brought me into their world not as a partner or an equal, but as a target. We have enough evidence to file criminal charges, Elena said. Document forgery, conspiracy to commit fraud, potential RICO violations, if we can prove this was a family enterprise. But I want to give you the choice of how to proceed. We can handle this through criminal courts, which could result in Marcus facing serious jail time, or we can use this evidence as leverage in the divorce proceedings to ensure he gets nothing and stays away from your business permanently. I didn't have to think about it. Both, I said. I want him prosecuted, and I want everyone to know exactly what kind of man he really is. Elena smiled, the kind of smile that makes opposing attorneys nervous. I was hoping you'd say that. That afternoon we walked into Judge Walsh's courtroom with a presentation that would change everything. Elena had prepared a detailed timeline showing Marcus's fraudulent activities, complete with financial records, digital forensics, and expert testimony. We had documentation proving that the partnership agreement was forged, that Marcus had paid for professional help in creating fake legal documents, and that this appeared to be part of a larger pattern of criminal behavior by his entire family. Marcus sat at the defendant's table with his expensive lawyers, still wearing that confident smile, still acting like he held all the cards. Caroline Thompson was shuffling through papers with the kind of aggressive efficiency that had made her reputation, clearly preparing to argue that the partnership agreement superseded any prenuptial arrangements. They had no idea what was about to hit them. Judge Walsh called the hearing to order, and Elena stood to address the court. Your Honor, she said, before we discuss the prenuptial agreement that Mr. Westbrook claims doesn't exist, I'd like to introduce evidence of a criminal conspiracy that goes to the heart of this case. I watched Marcus's face as Elena began her presentation, and for the first time since this whole nightmare began, I saw real fear in his eyes. The confident smile faltered, then disappeared entirely. Caroline Thompson looked confused, glancing between Elena's documents and her own files like she couldn't understand how the script had suddenly changed. Elena methodically presented each piece of evidence: the forged partnership agreement, the payments to legal document services, the digital timestamps proving premeditation, the pattern of fraud within the Westbrook family. She called her handwriting expert, who testified that my signature on the partnership agreement was definitely forged. She called the document authentication specialist, who explained how the paper and ink analysis proved the document was created years after its supposed date. Then she called Kevin Walsh himself. Walsh had been arrested that morning on multiple fraud charges, and had immediately agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. He took the stand and calmly explained how Marcus had hired him to create a fake partnership agreement that would allow him to claim ownership of his wife's business in the event of a divorce. Mr. Westbrook was very specific about what he needed, Walsh testified. He wanted a document that would look legitimate to a family court judge, but wouldn't need to be filed with state authorities where it might be discovered. He provided me with samples of his wife's handwriting and specific instructions about the terms of the partnership. He paid me $15,000 for the work and told me he might need similar services in the future. Marcus's lawyers tried to object, tried to discredit Walsh's testimony, tried to argue that this was all circumstantial evidence. But Elena had too much documentation, too many expert witnesses, too much digital proof. The case they'd built for Marcus's entitlement to my business crumbled in real time. But Elena wasn't finished. She'd saved the best for last. Your Honor, she said, pulling out the manila envelope I'd been carrying for weeks, I'd now like to introduce the prenuptial agreement that Mr. Westbrook signed 7 years ago, the document he claims doesn't exist. She handed copies to Judge Walsh, and to Caroline Thompson, and I watched Caroline's face go pale as she read through the term. The prenup was exactly what David Chen had explained all those years ago: comprehensive protection for separate assets, including businesses developed independently during the marriage, with no claims allowed on individual property or venture. As you can see, Your Honor, Elena continued, this document explicitly protects Mrs. Rodriguez's business assets and intellectual property. Mr. Westbrook signed this agreement voluntarily with full legal representation and with complete understanding of its terms. Judge Walsh studied both documents carefully, comparing the legitimate prenup with the forged partnership agreement. The contrast was stark. One was a properly executed legal contract with official notarization and filing. The other was sophisticated fraud designed to circumvent the very protections the prenup provided. When Judge Walsh finally spoke, her voice was cold with controlled anger. Mr. Westbrook, she said, you stand accused of document forgery, conspiracy to commit fraud, and perjury in these proceedings. I'm suspending this divorce hearing and referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for criminal prosecution. Rodriguez, your prenuptial agreement is valid and enforceable. Mr. Westbrook has no legal claim to any portion of your business assets. She turned back to Marcus, who was sitting frozen in his chair like a deer caught in headlights. Furthermore, I'm issuing a restraining order preventing you from having any contact with Mrs. Rodriguez or her business operations pending the outcome of criminal proceedings. You are to have no communication with her employees, her clients, or her financial institution. Any violation of this order will result in immediate arrest. Marcus finally found his voice. Your Honor, this is all a misunderstanding. I never, Mr. Westbrook, Judge Walsh interrupted. I strongly advise you to remain silent and consult with your attorneys about criminal representation. Nothing you say at this point is likely to improve your situation. Caroline Thompson was frantically whispering with her colleagues, clearly trying to figure out how to distance their firm from what was about to become a criminal case. The confident legal team that had walked into the courtroom an hour ago now looked like they wanted to disappear entirely. As the hearing concluded and the courtroom cleared, Marcus sat alone at the defendant's table, staring at the stack of evidence that had destroyed his carefully constructed lie. His expensive suit and confident demeanor couldn't protect him from the reality of what he'd done, and for the first time in 7 years, I saw him exactly as he really was. Not a successful businessman or a devoted husband, but a petty criminal who'd built his life on stealing from others. Elena and I walked out of that courtroom, knowing that justice was finally being served. The prenup that Marcus had signed without reading had protected my business exactly as intended. But more than that, his own criminal actions had ensured that he would face consequences far beyond losing a divorce case. The criminal investigation that followed revealed the full scope of the Westbrook family's fraudulent activities. Marcus was arrested 3 days later and charged with document forgery, conspiracy to commit fraud, and perjury. His father Richard and brother David were arrested on related charges after investigators found evidence of their own document fraud scheme. The family's real estate empire, built on decades of fraudulent contracts and stolen assets, began to collapse as victims came forward and prosecutors traced the pattern of criminal behavior. Kevin Walsh's cooperation led to the discovery of dozens of other fraudulent documents he'd created for various clients, resulting in multiple additional arrests and the recovery of millions of dollars in stolen assets. The Legal Document Services front company was shut down, and Walsh received a 5-year prison sentence for his role in the conspiracy. Marcus ultimately pleaded guilty to avoid a lengthy trial and received 3 years in federal prison, plus restitution requirements that would keep him financially devastated for decades to come. His mother Patricia's passive-aggressive comments about trust in traditional marriage looked pretty ironic when her son was led away in handcuffs. But the most satisfying moment came 6 months later, when I received a letter from Marcus in prison. It was a single page, handwritten on standard prison stationery, and it said exactly what I'd been waiting to hear for 7 years. Martha, I know you'll probably never forgive me, and you shouldn't. I lied to you from the beginning. I married you because I saw an opportunity, not because I loved you. You deserved better than what I gave you, And I'm sorry for everything I put you through. I hope you find happiness with someone who appreciates what an incredible woman you are. I read that letter once, then filed it away in the same box where I kept our divorce papers and the prenuptial agreement that had saved everything I'd worked for. Not because I wanted to remember Marcus, but because I wanted to remember the lesson I'd learned about trusting my instincts and protecting myself, even when it felt unromantic or cynical. Rodriguez's digital marketing continued to grow and thrive, expanding into new markets and developing innovative strategies that attracted clients from across the country. Without Marcus's interference and manipulation, my team was able to focus on what we did best, creating effective marketing campaigns that delivered real results for real businesses. I never remarried, but not because I was afraid of love or damaged by my experience with Mark. I simply learned to be more selective about the people I allowed into my life, more careful about distinguishing between genuine affection and calculated charm. I dated, I traveled, I built friendships with people who valued honesty and authenticity over manipulation and control. And every time I signed a legal document, every time I made a major business decision, every time I trusted someone with important information about my life, I remembered the lesson Marcus had inadvertently taught me, that the people who love you will respect your need to protect yourself, and the people who don't respect that need are the ones you most need protection from. The prenup he'd signed without reading had saved my business, but more importantly, it had saved me from spending the rest of my life wondering whether I was strong enough to stand up for myself when it really mattered. I was. I am. And I always will be. The morning after that emergency hearing, I woke up feeling like I'd been hit by a truck, not because of exhaustion, though I'd barely slept 3 hours, but because of the weight of everything I'd learned about the man I'd shared a bed with for 7 years. The criminal charges were just the beginning. As I sat in my kitchen with my first cup of coffee, staring at the pile of legal documents Elena had given me to review, I realized that Marcus's deception went far deeper than a forged partnership agreement. There were bank statements I'd never seen before, showing transfers between accounts I didn't know existed, credit applications in both our names for loans I'd never agreed to, insurance policies listing Marcus as the beneficiary of assets he had no legal right to claim, investment portfolios that supposedly included my business equity as collateral for trades I'd never authorized. It was like discovering that my entire financial life had been duplicated in some parallel universe where Marcus controlled everything. Elena had warned me this might happen. When someone commits fraud at this level, she'd said, they usually don't stop at one document. We need to audit everything. Every account, every contract, every piece of paper with your name on it. She'd recommended a forensic accountant named Thomas Kim, a former FBI financial crimes investigator who specialized in untangling complex fraud schemes. Thomas arrived at my office that Tuesday morning, carrying 3 laptops and a briefcase full of equipment that looked like it belonged in a spy movie. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe 35, with intense dark eyes and the kind of focused energy that made you believe he could find a needle in a haystack if he put his mind to it. Miss Rodriguez, he said, settling into the conference room I'd cleared for his use, I've reviewed the preliminary materials your attorney sent over. What we're looking at here isn't just document forgery, it's identity theft on a massive scale. Your ex-husband has been using your personal information and business credentials to conduct financial transactions without your knowledge or consent. He spread out printed copies of bank statements, loan applications, and investment documents across the conference table like he was building a crime scene reconstruction. Let me show you what I've found so far, and then we'll dig deeper into the digital record. The first revelation was a business line of credit for $200,000 that Marcus had secured using my company as collateral. He'd forged my signature on the application and provided falsified tax returns showing income that my business had never generated. The loan proceeds had been deposited into an account I'd never opened, then transferred immediately to an offshore investment fund registered in the Cayman Islands. When did you first become aware of this loan? Thomas asked. Right now, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I've never seen any of this before. Thomas nodded grimly. That's what I expected. The application was submitted electronically using your business tax ID number and personal social security number. but the contact information was all changed to phone numbers and email addresses controlled by your ex-husband. When the bank tried to verify the application, they reached him instead of you. The second discovery was even more disturbing. Marcus had opened 3 separate investment accounts using my identity, claiming to be acting under a power of attorney that he'd used these accounts to purchase high-risk derivatives and cryptocurrency investments, essentially gambling with money that the banks thought belonged to me. When the investments went bad, as they inevitably did, the losses were recorded against my credit rating and financial profile. How much are we talking about? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Thomas pulled up a spreadsheet on his laptop. Based on what I've uncovered so far, approximately $800,000 in unauthorized debt and investment losses attributed to your name and business. But we're still in the early stages of the investigation. I suspect there's more. I felt $800,000 was more than my business had generated in profit over the past 3 years. If creditors came after me for Marcus's fraudulent debts, it could destroy everything I'd worked to build. Prenup or no prenup, can they hold me responsible for debts I never agreed to? I asked. That depends on several factors, Thomas said. The good news is that we have clear evidence of fraud, which should absolve you of legal responsibility. The bad news is that proving fraud takes time, and in the meantime, your credit and business reputation could be severely damaged. We need to move quickly to notify creditors and financial institutions about what's happened. Elena joined us that afternoon to help navigate the legal implications of Thomas's discovery. She brought with her a stack of paperwork that would allow us to file fraud alerts with credit reporting agencies and begin the process of disputing the unauthorized debts. But she also brought news that made my stomach drop even further. I heard from the prosecutor's office this morning, she said. They've expanded their investigation into Marcus's activities, and they want to interview you about potential additional victims. It turns out that your ex-husband didn't just target you. He's been running similar schemes against other women he's been involved with. The thought that Marcus had done this to other people filled me with a mixture of rage and sympathy. How many other women had trusted him with their hearts and their financial information, only to discover years later that he'd been systematically robbing them? How many other businesses had been damaged or destroyed by his criminal activities? Who else? I asked. They can't give me specific names due to the ongoing investigation, Elena said, but they've identified at least 4 other women who were romantically involved with Marcus over the past 15 years. Each of them experienced similar patterns of financial manipulation and identity theft. One lost her house. Another had her business partnership dissolved when her credit rating was destroyed by Marcus's fraudulent activities. I thought about Jessica, Marcus's secretary, the woman he'd left me for. Was she his next target, or was she somehow involved in his scheme? The timing of their relationship seemed suspicious now that I knew how long Marcus had been planning his fraudulent activities. Had he been grooming her as an accomplice, or was she just another victim waiting to happen? Thomas was still working through the digital forensics when his laptop chimed with an alert. He frowned at the screen, typed a few commands, then looked up at Elena and me with an expression I couldn't read. We have a problem, he said. Someone just attempted to access your business banking accounts using the fraudulent credentials. The attempt was blocked by the security alerts we put in place yesterday, but whoever did this knows that we're investigating the fraud. My blood went cold. Marcus is in jail. How could he be trying to access my accounts? He's not doing it himself, Thomas said, pulling up security logs on his screen. The access attempt came from an IP address registered to Westbrook Real Estate. Someone at his family's company is trying to continue the fraud scheme, even while Marcus is behind bars. Elena was already reaching for her phone. I'm calling the prosecutor's office. This proves that the fraud conspiracy extends beyond Marcus to other members of his family. They need to know about this immediately. As Elena spoke with the prosecutors, Thomas continued analyzing the digital evidence from the access attempt. He was able to trace the specific computer that had been used to try to breach my accounts, and what he found was deeply disturbing. The computer belongs to Patricia Westbrook, he said, Marcus's mother. She was using the same fraudulent credentials that Marcus created, which means she's been aware of and participating in the identity theft scheme. I remembered Patricia's comments about trust and traditional marriage, her disapproval of the prenup, her passive-aggressive suggestions that I was being cold and calculating. Had she known all along that her son was planning to defraud me? Had she helped him create the fake documents and false accounts? Had her disapproval of the prenup been motivated not by romantic ideals, but by criminal intent? The prosecutor's office moved quickly to obtain warrants for the Westbrook real estate offices and Patricia's personal residence. That evening, as I watched the local news coverage of FBI agents carrying boxes of evidence out of the family's business headquarters, I felt a strange mixture of vindication and sadness. Vindication because the truth was finally coming out. Sadness because I realized how completely I'd been deceived by people I'd considered family. The news coverage was extensive. The story of a prominent local family being arrested for financial fraud was exactly the kind of scandal that captured public attention, especially when it involved a sophisticated scheme to steal from multiple victims. The reporters interviewed former business associates who described the Westbrooks as pillars of the community, respected entrepreneurs who'd built their fortune through hard work and smart investments. If they only knew the truth. Thomas worked late into the night, following digital trails and uncovering new layers of the conspiracy. By morning, he'd discovered that the fraud scheme had been operating for nearly 20 years, with victims scattered across 3 states. The Westbrooks had developed a sophisticated system for identifying wealthy women, particularly business owners and entrepreneurs, then targeting them for long-term financial manipulation. Marcus hadn't been the only family member running romantic scams. His brother David had been married 4 times, each marriage ending in divorce proceedings where he'd attempted to claim assets that didn't belong to him. His cousin Michael had been engaged 6 times but never married, apparently using long-term relationships to gain access to women's financial information without the legal complications of divorce. The family had even developed a network of accomplices and service providers to support their criminal activity. Kevin Walsh's document forgery operation was just one piece of a larger infrastructure that included corrupt accountants, complicit real estate agents, and financial advisors who helped move stolen assets through shell companies and offshore accounts. This wasn't just opportunistic fraud, Thomas explained as he showed me the organizational chart he'd created to map the conspiracy. This was a criminal enterprise with specialized roles and systematic methods. Marcus wasn't just stealing from you. He was following a playbook that his family had developed and refined over decades. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Federal investigators estimated that the Westbrook family had stolen over $12 million from victims across multiple states, using a combination of romantic manipulation, identity theft, and document fraud. They'd owned luxury homes, expensive cars, and successful businesses, all built on a foundation of stolen money and ruined lives. But as overwhelming as these revelations were, they also provided a strange sense of relief. For years I'd blamed myself for not seeing through Marcus's lies, for being naive enough to trust someone who was systematically deceiving me. Now I understood that I hadn't been outsmarted by a charming sociopath. I'd been targeted by a professional criminal organization with decades of experience in financial fraud. Elena used these discoveries to strengthen our position in the divorce proceeding. The evidence of organized criminal activity made it clear that Marcus had never been a legitimate spouse, seeking fair distribution of marital assets. He'd been a criminal who'd married me as part of a long-term theft scheme. The prenup wasn't just legally binding, it was the only thing that had prevented me from losing everything to an elaborate con game. Judge Walsh scheduled another hearing to review the expanded evidence and consider additional protective measures. This time when we walked into the courtroom, Marcus wasn't there. He'd been transferred to federal custody pending additional charges related to the broader conspiracy investigation. His expensive lawyers had been replaced by a public defender who looked overwhelmed by the scope of the case. Patricia Westbrook was there though, sitting in the gallery with her own attorney and looking like a completely different person from the elegant socialite who'd criticized my prenup 7 years. Her perfectly styled hair was disheveled, her designer clothes replaced by a simple gray suit, and her confident demeanor replaced by the nervous energy of someone who knew she was facing serious criminal charges. Judge Walsh reviewed Thomas's forensic analysis and Elena's legal arguments with the same careful attention she'd given our original evidence. But this time, her questions focused not on the validity of the prenup or the legitimacy of Marcus's claims, but on the extent of the fraud and the measures needed to protect other potential victims. "Miss Rodriguez," she said, Based on the evidence presented, it's clear that you were the victim of a sophisticated criminal conspiracy that extended far beyond the document forgery we discussed at our previous hearing. The court finds that your marriage to Ms. Westbrook was entered into under false pretenses, with fraudulent intent on his part, and that any claims he might have had to marital property are invalidated by his criminal conduct. She continued. Furthermore, the court is ordering full restitution for any financial damages you've suffered as a result of this conspiracy to be paid from seized assets of the Westbrook criminal enterprise. The fraudulent debts and investment losses attributed to your name are hereby declared null and void, and the court will provide documentation to that effect for use in disputing these items with creditors and credit reporting agencies. But Judge Walsh wasn't finished. She turned to address Patricia Westbrook directly. Mrs. Westbrook, your participation in this conspiracy represents a particularly egregious breach of trust and decency. You used your position as a mother-in-law and family member to facilitate the financial victimization of a woman who welcomed you into her life. The court finds your conduct especially reprehensible and will recommend the maximum penalties allowed under federal sentencing guidelines. Patricia's attorney tried to argue that his client had been manipulated by her son, that she'd been unaware of the full scope of the criminal enterprise. But the evidence was too overwhelming. The computer forensics showed that Patricia had been actively participating in the fraud scheme for years, not just with my accounts but with other victims as well. She'd been one of the primary architects of the conspiracy, not an unwitting accomplice. As the hearing concluded and the courtroom cleared, I felt a sense of closure that I hadn't expected. The legal proceedings weren't just about protecting my business or recovering stolen assets. They were about establishing the truth and ensuring that the people who'd victimized me and others would face appropriate consequences. Elena and I walked out of that courthouse knowing that justice was being served not just for me, but for all the women who'd been targeted by the Westbrook family's criminal enterprise. The prenup that Marcus had signed without reading had protected my business, but the investigation it had triggered was protecting countless other potential victims from future fraud. The media coverage continued for weeks as more victims came forward, and federal prosecutors expanded their investigation. The story became a cautionary tale about romance scams and financial fraud, featured in newspapers, magazines, and television programs across the country. I was interviewed several times, always emphasizing the importance of protecting your assets and trusting your instincts when something feels wrong. But the most satisfying development came when Jessica, Marcus's secretary and supposed new girlfriend, contacted Elena's office requesting a meeting. She'd seen the news coverage and realized that she'd been targeted as Marcus's next victim. The romantic relationship she'd thought was genuine had actually been part of his criminal strategy, and she had evidence that could help prosecutors build an even stronger case against the entire Westbrook family. Thomas continued his forensic investigation for several more weeks, eventually uncovering evidence of fraud totaling over $20 million. The Westbrook family's criminal enterprise had been one of the most sophisticated romantic fraud operations in federal law enforcement history, with victims in 12 states and evidence of international money laundering through Caribbean shell companies. Marcus ultimately received a 15-year federal prison sentence after pleading guilty to conspiracy, fraud, and money laundering charges. Patricia received 12 years for her role in organizing and directing the criminal enterprise. David and Michael Westbrook received similar sentences, and several other family members and accomplices were charged with related crimes. The seized assets from the criminal enterprise were sufficient to provide full restitution to all identified victims, including the $800,000 in fraudulent debts that had been attributed to my name and business. More importantly, the investigation led to changes in banking and credit procedures that would make it much more difficult for similar fraud schemes to operate undetected in the future. But perhaps the most meaningful outcome was the support network that developed among the victims. We stayed in contact with each other, sharing our experiences and providing emotional support as we all worked to rebuild our lives after discovering that our most intimate relationships had been criminal conspiracies. Sarah Martinez, the woman who'd lost her house to Marcus's fraud, eventually started a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping romance scam victims recover their assets and rebuild their credit. Jennifer Thompson, whose business partnership had been destroyed by fraudulent debts, became an advocate for stronger identity theft protections and testified before Congress about the need for financial reform. Lisa Chen, who'd been engaged to Michael Westbrook, used her experience to become a licensed private investigator specializing in background checks for people entering serious relationships. She developed screening procedures that could identify potential fraud risks before victims lost their money or their hearts to professional criminals. As for me, I focused on rebuilding Rodriguez's digital marketing and using my experience to help other entrepreneurs protect themselves from similar schemes. I developed cybersecurity protocols that could detect unauthorized access attempts like the ones Thomas had discovered. I created educational materials about financial fraud prevention that we shared with our clients and business partners. The investigation had revealed that my business had actually been much more successful than I'd realized. Marcus's interference and manipulation had been holding back my company's growth, creating artificial obstacles and limitations that disappeared once his influence was removed. Without his sabotage, Rodriguez's digital marketing expanded rapidly, attracting new clients and developing innovative services that established us as leaders in our industry. I also became more selective about my personal relationships, but not in a way that made me cynical or closed off to love. Instead, I developed better instincts for recognizing genuine affection versus calculated charm. I learned to pay attention to red flags I'd previously ignored, and I became comfortable with setting boundaries and asking difficult questions when something didn't feel right. The forensic investigation had shown me that Marcus's deception had been so sophisticated that even experienced professionals might have been fooled. The documents he'd forged were nearly perfect. The fake accounts he'd created were convincing replicas of legitimate financial products, and the emotional manipulation he'd used was based on psychological techniques developed by professional con artists. I hadn't been naive or stupid to trust him. I'd been targeted by experts who'd spent decades perfecting their criminal methods. Understanding this helped me move past the self-blame and shame I'd carried since discovering the truth about my marriage. I'd been a victim, not a fool. And there was an important difference between those two things. The prenuptial agreement that had saved my business became a symbol not just of financial protection, but of the importance of trusting your instincts even when other people try to make you doubt them. Marcus and his family had spent years trying to convince me that the prenup was unnecessary, unromantic, and insulting. They'd pressured me to abandon the very legal protection that would eventually expose their criminal conspiracy. If I'd listened to them, if I'd allowed their manipulation to override my own judgment, I would have lost everything. My business, my financial security, my sense of self-worth, all would have been sacrificed to a criminal enterprise that saw me as nothing more than a source of money to be stolen and a life to be destroyed. Instead, I'd stood my ground, insisted on protecting myself, and ultimately uncovered a conspiracy that had victimized dozens of other women. The prenup hadn't just saved my business, it had triggered an investigation that brought justice to criminals who might otherwise have continued their fraud schemes for years to come. As Thomas completed his forensic analysis and Elena finalized the legal proceedings, I realized that this experience had taught me something invaluable about the difference between love and manipulation. Real love supports your need to protect yourself and respects your right to make independent decisions. Real love doesn't try to talk you out of taking precautions or make you feel guilty for being careful with your trust. Marcus had never loved me. He'd studied me, calculated my vulnerabilities, and exploited my emotions for financial gain, but he'd also underestimated my intelligence and my determination to protect what I'd worked so hard to build. In the end, his own criminal arrogance had led to his downfall and the destruction of his entire family's illegal empire. The prenup he'd signed without reading had been his first mistake, but it wasn't his last. Every forged document, every fraudulent transaction, every lie he'd told had created evidence that would eventually be used to convict him and his accomplices. He'd thought he was too smart to get caught, too charming to be suspected, and too well connected to face serious consequences. He was wrong about all of it. The phone call came at 6:30 on a Thursday morning, jolting me awake from the first decent sleep I'd had in weeks. The caller ID showed Elena's office number, which immediately sent my pulse racing. Lawyers don't typically call before 7 unless something urgent has happened. "Martha, we need to meet today." Elena's voice was tense, professional, but with an undercurrent of excitement that I couldn't quite identify. The FBI forensic team found something significant in the Westbrook family computers. Something that changes everything we thought we knew about this case. I was already reaching for my clothes before she finished speaking. What kind of the kind that we shouldn't discuss over the phone. Can you be at my office by 8? Agent Rodriguez from the Financial Crimes Unit will be joining us. Agent Rodriguez turned out to be a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s with the kind of intense focus that made you believe she could spot a lie from across the room. She had a laptop, 3 file folders, and an expression that suggested she'd seen every type of financial fraud imaginable but had found something in this case that genuinely surprised her. Miss Rodriguez, she began, and I noticed the coincidence of our shared last name with a slight smile. I've been investigating financial fraud for 12 years, and what we've uncovered in your case is unprecedented in terms of scope and sophistication. But what I'm about to show you goes beyond anything we initially suspected. She opened her laptop and pulled up what looked like a complex organizational chart with dozens of names, dates, and connecting lines. This is a visual representation of what we've discovered about the Westbrook family's criminal operations. What started as investigating your ex-husband's document forgery has revealed a multi-generational criminal enterprise that spans 4 decades and involves over 200 victims. My hands went cold. 200 victims. I thought about all the women who'd trusted members of the Westbrook family, who'd opened their hearts and their bank accounts to people who saw them as nothing more than opportunities for theft. Agent Rodriguez clicked to another screen showing financial records. The family's criminal activities began in the early 1980s with Marcus's grandfather, William Westbrook. He developed the initial framework for what they called relationship asset acquisition, essentially a systematic approach to identifying, targeting, and financially exploiting romantic partners. She showed me documents that looked like business plans, complete with target demographics, success metrics, and profit projection. The Westbrook family had literally turned romance fraud into a corporate enterprise, with each generation refining and expanding the methods developed by their predecessor. William Westbrook documented his techniques in what he called the Acquisition Manual, a comprehensive guide to selecting victims, building trust, accessing financial information, and extracting maximum value from each relationship. This manual was passed down through the family and updated with new techniques as technology and financial systems evolved. Elena was taking notes furiously as Agent Rodriguez continued her presentation. I sat in stunned silence, trying to process the idea that my marriage hadn't just been a lie, it had been the implementation of a criminal methodology that had been developed and perfected over 40 years. Marcus's father, Richard, expanded the operation in the 1990s by incorporating legitimate business elements that provided cover for the fraud activity. Westbrook Real Estate wasn't just a successful business, it was a front that gave the family credibility and access to financial networks they could exploit. The agent showed me property records, loan documents, and investment portfolios that revealed how the real estate business had been used to launder stolen money and create false credentials for family members. Richard Westbrook had been stealing from his own clients, using their property investments to secure loans that funded the family's criminal activities. Patricia Westbrook's role was particularly sophisticated. Agent Rodriguez continued. She functioned as the family's social intelligence coordinator, using her position in various charitable organizations and social clubs to identify potential victims and gather background information about their financial situation. I remembered all the charity galas and social events that Patricia had insisted we attend during my marriage to Marcus. I'd thought she was trying to include me in her social circle, to help me network and build connections that could benefit my business. Now I realized she'd been evaluating me, gathering information about my assets and business operations that she could pass along to Marcus for use in his fraud scheme. The family maintained detailed files on hundreds of potential victims, Agent Rodriguez said, clicking to a database interface that looked disturbingly professional. They tracked income levels, business ownership, inheritance prospects, family relationships, even psychological profiles that identified emotional vulnerabilities they could exploit. She pulled up a file with my name on it, and my stomach dropped. The document contained information about my business, my personal finances, my relationship with my family, even details about my mother's divorce and how it had affected my views on financial security. The file was dated 3 months before I'd first met Marcus at that networking event. Our meeting wasn't accidental, I said, the words coming out as barely more than a whisper. No, it wasn't, Agent Rodriguez confirmed. Marcus had been assigned to target you specifically. The family had identified you as an ideal victim, successful business owner, limited family support network, previous experience with divorce trauma that made you susceptible to financial manipulation. The networking event where Marcus and I had met, the charming coincidence of our shared interests, the way he'd seemed to understand my business challenges so perfectly, all of it had been calculated. He'd studied me like a hunter studies prey, learning my habits and preferences so he could present himself as the perfect partner. Elena finally spoke up. How extensive are these victim files? How many other women were targeted? Agent Rodriguez pulled up another screen, showing a map of the United States with colored pins scattered across multiple states. We've identified active files on over 300 potential victims, with completed fraud operations against at least 200 confirmed targets. The total financial damage is estimated at $47 million. $47 million. The number was so large it felt abstract, like a statistic from a news report rather than something connected to my personal experience. But each of those millions represented someone's life savings, someone's business, someone's dreams, that had been stolen by people they'd trusted with their hearts. What we're dealing with here, Agent Rodriguez continued, is potentially the largest romantic fraud operation in FBI history. The Westbrook family didn't just commit isolated crimes. They built a criminal organization with sophisticated intelligence gathering, victim selection criteria, standardized fraud methodologies, and even customer service protocols for managing multiple ongoing schemes simultaneously. She showed me communication logs between family members that read like business memos. Marcus would send updates to Patricia about Project M, which I now realized was me, reporting on milestones like financial access secured and legal documentation completed. Patricia would respond with strategic advice about maintaining subject compliance and optimizing asset extraction timelines. The family actually held quarterly meetings to review their criminal operations, Agent Rodriguez said. They evaluated the success of different fraud techniques, shared intelligence about new potential victims, and allocated resources to maximize their return on investment. They treated crime like a business because, to them, that's exactly what it was. Elena was shaking her head in disbelief. How did they operate for so long without being detected? 40 years of systematic fraud seems like it would leave a trail. They were exceptionally careful about compartmentalization and operational security, Agent Rodriguez explained. Each family member had specific roles and responsibilities, and they limited communication to encrypted channels and face-to-face meetings. They also spread their activities across multiple states and jurisdictions, making it difficult for law enforcement agencies to identify patterns. The agent pulled up financial records showing how the family had used a network of shell companies, offshore accounts, and legitimate business fronts to hide their stolen assets. They reinvested their criminal proceeds into legitimate businesses and real estate holdings, creating the appearance of successful entrepreneurs while actually being career criminals. But their sophistication had also been their downfall. The electronic records they'd maintained for operational efficiency had created a comprehensive evidence trail that FBI forensic specialists could follow. Every victim file, every fraud operation, every financial transaction had been documented in digital formats that couldn't be destroyed or hidden. The irony, Agent Rodriguez said with a slight smile, is that their business-like approach to crime created the exact type of evidence we need to prosecute them under RICO statutes. They essentially documented their own criminal conspiracy for us. Elena was already thinking like a lawyer. What does this mean for Martha's case specifically? And what are the implications for other victims? For Ms. Rodriguez, this investigation validates everything we suspected about her ex-husband's criminal intent and provides overwhelming evidence for both civil and criminal proceedings, Agent Rodriguez said. Her prenuptial agreement was the key that unlocked this entire investigation. Without that document, Marcus's fraud might have succeeded, and this criminal organization might have continued operating indefinitely. The thought sent chills down my spine. If I'd listened to Marcus and his family about the prenup being unnecessary, if I'd allowed their manipulation to override my instincts about protecting my assets, this entire criminal enterprise might still be active. Other women might still be getting targeted, manipulated, and financially destroyed by people they trusted. As for other victims, Agent Rodriguez continued, we're implementing the largest victim notification and restitution program in FBI history. Every person who was defrauded by the Westbrook family will be contacted and offered assistance in recovering their stolen assets and rebuilding their financial security. She explained that the FBI had partnered with financial institutions, credit reporting agencies, and victim advocacy organizations to provide comprehensive support for everyone who'd been affected by the conspiracy. We're not just pursuing criminal prosecutions, we're working to repair the damage that this criminal organization inflicted on hundreds of innocent people. Elena asked about the timeline for additional arrests and prosecution. Agent Rodriguez pulled up another organizational chart showing family members, associates, and accomplices who were still under investigation. We've identified 17 additional suspects with varying levels of involvement in the conspiracy, she said. Some were full participants who actively committed fraud. Others were accomplices who provided support services like document forgery or money laundering. We expect to make additional arrests over the next several weeks as we complete our investigation. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. The Westbrook family had built a criminal empire that included lawyers, accountants, real estate agents, financial advisors, and even some law enforcement officials who'd been corrupted or compromised. They'd created an entire ecosystem of criminal activity that had infected multiple legitimate industries. One of the most disturbing aspects of this case, Agent Rodriguez said, is how the family recruited and trained new criminals to expand their operation. Marcus's cousin David had been grooming his own son to continue the family business, teaching him fraud techniques and introducing him to potential victims. The idea that this criminal enterprise was being passed down to yet another generation made me feel sick. How many more women would have been victimized if this investigation hadn't exposed the conspiracy? How many more lives would have been destroyed by people who saw romance as nothing more than an opportunity for theft? Agent Rodriguez closed her laptop and looked directly at me. Miss Rodriguez, I want you to understand something important. Your decision to insist on that prenuptial agreement, and your courage in fighting back when you discovered the fraud, didn't just save your own business. It potentially saved dozens of other women from becoming victims of this criminal organization. She continued, the Westbrook family was planning to expand their operations into new markets and recruit additional family members into their fraud scheme. Your resistance disrupted their timeline and forced them to make mistakes that exposed their entire network to law enforcement. Elena gathered her notes and prepared to leave, but Agent Rodriguez had one more revelation that would change everything I thought I knew about my relationship with Marcus. There's something else you need to know, she said, opening one of her file folders. The investigation revealed that Marcus was never actually divorced from his first wife. Their marriage was never legally dissolved, which means your marriage to him was invalid from the beginning. The words hit me like a physical blow. Invalid marriage. I'd spent 7 years believing I was married to someone who was already married to someone else. Everything I'd thought I knew about my legal status, my relationship, my identity as Marcus's wife, had been another lie in a web of deception that seemed to have no bottom. His first wife, Rebecca Chen, was one of the family's early victims, Agent Rodriguez explained. She was targeted in 2005, defrauded of approximately $200,000, and then abandoned when the family moved on to new targets. She never pursued divorce proceedings because she believed Marcus had died in a car accident, another fiction the family created to avoid legal complications. If Martha's marriage was invalid, does that affect the prenuptial agreement, or any of the other legal proceedings? Actually, it strengthens her position, Agent Rodriguez said. Since there was no valid marriage, Marcus had no legal claim to any marital property under any circumstance. The prenuptial agreement is irrelevant because there was no marriage for it to govern. Mrs. Rodriguez's assets were never at risk through divorce proceedings because she was never actually married. The revelation should have been a relief, but instead it felt like one more violation, one more way that Marcus had lied to me about the fundamental nature of our relationship. I hadn't just been targeted for financial fraud. I'd been tricked into a completely fictitious legal relationship that gave Marcus access to my life and my assets under false pretenses. What happened to Rebecca Chen? I asked. She's been contacted by our victim services team and is receiving assistance in recovering her stolen assets. Agent Rodriguez said. She's also provided valuable information about the family's early fraud operations that helped us understand how their criminal methods evolved over time. Agent Rodriguez explained that Rebecca's experience had been used by the Westbrook family to refine their victim selection and fraud techniques. They'd learned from their mistakes in her case and developed more sophisticated methods for the victims who came after her, including me. The family actually maintained a database of lessons learned from each fraud operation, she said. They analyzed what worked, what didn't work, and how they could improve their success rates with future victims. It was criminal activity conducted with the same systematic approach that legitimate businesses use for process improvement. Elena was reviewing her notes when she looked up with a question that had been bothering me as well. Agent Rodriguez, how did the FBI initially become aware of this conspiracy? Martha's case exposed the fraud, but what led federal investigators to look at the broader pattern? Agent Rodriguez smiled. Actually, it was Thomas Kim's forensic analysis of Ms. Rodriguez's financial records that first identified the systematic nature of the fraud. When he discovered the offshore accounts and shell companies, he recognized patterns that suggested organized criminal activity rather than individual fraud. She explained that Thomas had contacted the FBI after discovering evidence that suggested Marcus's fraud operation was part of a larger network. His expertise in financial crimes investigation allowed him to identify indicators that most forensic accountants might have missed. He recognized that the sophistication of the fraud scheme suggested professional criminal organization rather than opportunistic theft. The FBI had initially opened the investigation as a financial fraud case, but as they dug deeper into the evidence, they discovered the multi-generational nature of the conspiracy and the systematic targeting of victims across multiple states. What started as investigating your ex-husband's crimes became one of the largest organized crime investigations we've conducted in recent years. Agent Rodriguez gathered her materials and prepared to leave, but she had one final piece of information that would help me understand the full scope of what I'd unwittingly uncovered. Ms. Rodriguez, the evidence we've gathered in this investigation will likely result in criminal prosecutions that continue for several years. The Westbrook family and their associates face charges under federal RICO statutes, which carry penalties of up to 20 years in prison and forfeiture of all assets obtained through criminal activity. She continued, more importantly, the investigation has led to changes in federal law enforcement procedures for identifying and prosecuting organized romance fraud operations. Your case has literally changed how the FBI investigates these types of crimes. Elena walked with me to the parking garage after our meeting with Agent Rodriguez, and we stood by my car talking about the overwhelming scope of what we'd learned. $47 million in stolen assets, over 200 victims, a criminal enterprise that had operated for 4 decades, a systematic approach to romance fraud that had been refined and perfected across multiple generations. Martha, Elena said, I want you to understand that what you've been through goes far beyond a typical divorce case or even a typical fraud case. You were targeted by what amounts to a professional criminal organization that specialized in the exact type of manipulation and theft that you experienced. She continued, the fact that you insisted on protecting yourself with that prenuptial agreement, and the fact that you had the courage to fight back when you discovered the fraud, has resulted in justice for hundreds of other victims who might never have received it otherwise. But as I drove home that afternoon, thinking about everything Agent Rodriguez had revealed, I felt overwhelmed by the scope of the conspiracy I'd uncovered. 200 victims meant 200 women who'd experienced some version of what I'd been through. 200 women who'd trusted someone with their hearts and their financial security, only to discover that they'd been systematically deceived and robbed. The thought of Rebecca Chen, Marcus's first wife who'd believed he was dead, haunted me. She'd been living for nearly 20 years thinking that her husband had died in a car accident, never knowing that he'd simply moved on to new victims and new fraud operations. How many other women were out there who didn't even know they'd been victimized because the Westbrook family had covered their tracks so thoroughly? That evening, I called Thomas Kim to thank him for his role in exposing the conspiracy and to ask him about his decision to contact the FBI. I needed to understand how a routine forensic accounting investigation had revealed such a massive criminal enterprise. "Martha," Thomas said, "when I first started analyzing your financial records, I was looking for evidence of individual fraud, forged documents, unauthorized transactions, identity theft. But what I found was too sophisticated for a single person to have created." He explained that the digital forensics had revealed communication patterns, organizational structures, and operational procedures that suggested professional criminal activity. The offshore accounts weren't just hiding stolen money, they were part of a complex financial network designed to launder criminal proceeds and support ongoing fraud operations. Thomas had recognized that the evidence he'd uncovered suggested a criminal organization rather than individual criminal activity, and he'd contacted the FBI because he knew that federal resources would be needed to investigate the full scope of the conspiracy. "Your case was the key that unlocked everything," he said. "The prenuptial agreement provided the legal protection you needed, but it also created the evidence trail that exposed the entire criminal enterprise. Without that document, Marcus's fraud might have succeeded, and this investigation never would have happened." The next morning brought news that would reshape everything I thought I knew about the investigation. Elena called to tell me that 3 more Westbrook family members had been arrested overnight, including Marcus's uncle William Jr., who had apparently been running similar fraud operations on the West Coast. "The investigation is expanding faster than anyone anticipated," Elena said. "The FBI is now coordinating with law enforcement agencies in 8 states and has identified potential victims in 12 additional states. This case is becoming a national story." The media coverage intensified over the following weeks as more details about the Westbrook family's criminal enterprise became public. News reports described it as one of the largest romance fraud operations in U.S. history, with victims ranging from small business owners to wealthy widows to successful professionals who'd been systematically targeted and financially destroyed. I was interviewed by several national news outlets about my experience and the role that the prenuptial agreement had played in exposing the conspiracy. I tried to focus on the importance of financial self-protection and trusting your instincts when something feels wrong. But I also wanted people to understand that the victims of this conspiracy weren't naive or gullible. They'd been targeted by professional criminals with decades of experience in manipulation and fraud. "The Westbrook family didn't just steal money," I told one reporter. "They stole trust, they stole hope, they stole the ability to believe that love could be genuine and sincere." The financial damage was devastating, but the emotional damage was even worse because it made victims doubt their own judgment about people and relationships. The investigation continued to reveal new layers of the conspiracy almost daily. Financial records showed that the family had been investing their criminal proceeds in legitimate businesses, real estate developments, and even charitable organizations that they'd used to gain credibility and access to new potential victims. Patricia Westbrook's involvement in various charity boards and social organizations hadn't been community service. It had been intelligence gathering for criminal purposes. She'd used her access to donor lists and financial information to identify wealthy women who could be targeted by her family's fraud operations. The family had essentially infiltrated legitimate social and business networks, Agent Rodriguez explained during one of our follow-up meetings. They used their positions in these organizations to gather information about potential victims and to create the appearance of respectability that made their fraud schemes more believable. The FBI had discovered that the family maintained detailed psychological profiles of their victims, including information about emotional vulnerabilities, relationship histories, and financial decision-making patterns. They'd used this information to customize their fraud approaches for maximum effectiveness with each target. They studied their victims the way legitimate businesses study their customers, Agent Rodriguez said. They identified what each person needed emotionally and financially, then presented themselves as the solution to those needs, while systematically stealing everything their victims owned. Thomas Kim's forensic analysis had uncovered evidence that the family had been planning to expand their operations internationally, with preliminary victim identification activities in Canada, the United Kingdom, and Australia. They were building a global criminal enterprise, he explained. Your resistance disrupted their expansion timeline and forced them to make the mistakes that exposed their domestic operations to law enforcement. The realization that my decision to fight back had potentially saved victims in other countries added another layer of significance to everything that had happened. The prenuptial agreement that Marcus had dismissed as unromantic and unnecessary had not only protected my business, but had potentially prevented an international criminal conspiracy from victimizing women around the world. As the investigation entered its third month, the FBI announced that they'd recovered over $38 million in stolen assets from the Westbrook family's criminal enterprise. The money had been hidden in offshore accounts, shell companies, and investments in legitimate businesses that the family had purchased with their criminal proceeds. The asset recovery operation is one of the most successful in FBI history, Agent Rodriguez told me during our final official meeting. Nearly 80% of the stolen money has been identified and secured for restitution to victims. This level of recovery is unprecedented in organized fraud cases. She explained that the family's business-like approach to crime had made asset recovery easier because they'd maintained detailed records of their criminal proceeds and investments. They documented everything for tax purposes and operational efficiency, which created a comprehensive audit trail for us to follow. The victim restitution program was being administered by a special FBI task force that included financial specialists, victim advocates, and legal experts. Every identified victim would receive full compensation for their financial losses, plus assistance in repairing credit damage and identity theft issues caused by the conspiracy. The goal is to make every victim whole again, both financially and in terms of their credit and legal standing, Agent Rodriguez said. We want to undo every aspect of the damage that this criminal organization inflicted on innocent people. But for me, the most meaningful aspect of the investigation wasn't the financial recovery or even the criminal prosecution. It was the knowledge that my decision to trust my instincts and protect myself had resulted in justice for hundreds of other women who'd been victimized by the same criminal enterprise. The prenuptial agreement that Marcus had signed without reading hadn't just saved my business. It had triggered an investigation that exposed one of the largest and most sophisticated romance fraud operations in American history. My refusal to be manipulated out of protecting my assets had ultimately protected countless other potential victims from similar fraud schemes. Elena and I met one final time to review the completed legal proceedings and discuss the broader implications of everything that had been uncovered. The divorce case that had started with Marcus demanding half of my business had evolved into a federal criminal investigation that would reshape how law enforcement approached organized romance fraud. Martha, Elena said, what you've accomplished here goes far beyond protecting your own assets or even exposing this particular criminal conspiracy. You've helped create legal precedents and investigative procedures that will protect other victims for years to come. The case had resulted in changes to federal fraud investigation protocols, new cooperation agreements between financial institutions and law enforcement agencies, and legislative proposals for stronger protections against romance fraud and identity theft. Your prenuptial agreement didn't just protect your business, Elena continued. It became the foundation for one of the most significant organized crime investigations in recent FBI history. You should be proud of what you've accomplished, not just for yourself, but for every victim of this conspiracy, who finally received justice. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity when federal Judge Harrison Miller called the case of United States Westbrook criminal enterprise to order on a cold Tuesday morning in November. Media representatives filled the gallery, sketch artists positioned themselves for clear sightlines, and federal marshals maintained order as the biggest organized crime trial in the district's recent history began. I sat in the front row with Elena and Agent Rodriguez, watching as Marcus, Patricia, Richard, David, and 6 other family members and associates were led into the courtroom in handcuffs. The confident, polished people who had once intimidated me with their wealth and social connections now looked like exactly what they were: career criminals facing the consequences of decades of systematic fraud. Marcus avoided eye contact as he was seated at the defendant's table. His expensive suits had been replaced by standard orange prison uniforms, his perfectly styled hair was disheveled, and the arrogant smile that had once charmed me into trusting him was nowhere to be seen. Patricia sat beside him, no longer the elegant socialite who had criticized my prenup as unromantic, but a defeated woman whose criminal empire was crumbling around her. Federal prosecutor Sarah Williams stood to deliver her opening statement, and her words would reshape how everyone in that courtroom understood the scope of what the Westbrook family had accomplished over 4 decades of criminal activity. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, "what you will hear over the next several weeks is not the story of isolated criminal acts or individual cases of fraud. What you will hear is the story of a criminal organization that operated like a Fortune 500 company, with systematic victim identification, standardized fraud procedures, quality control measures, and profit optimization strategies that generated over $50 million in stolen assets." She clicked a remote control and a massive organizational chart appeared on screens throughout the courtroom. The defendants operated what they called relationship asset acquisition, a sophisticated form of romance fraud that targeted successful women across 12 states and potentially multiple countries. They maintained databases of potential victims, psychological profiles for manipulation techniques, and detailed operational procedures that were refined and improved over multiple generations. Prosecutor Williams walked the jury through the evidence that Agent Rodriguez and Thomas Kim had painstakingly assembled, financial records showing the movement of stolen money through offshore accounts, digital communications between family members, coordinating fraud operations, victim files containing personal information gathered through social engineering and criminal surveillance. The evidence will show that Mrs. Martha Rodriguez was targeted specifically because she met the criminal organization's criteria for an ideal victim. She was a successful business owner with limited family support, previous experience with financial trauma, and assets that could be accessed through marriage fraud. Her case was assigned to defendant Marcus Westbrook, who spent months studying her business operations, personal relationships, and emotional vulnerabilities before engineering their supposedly accidental meeting. The prosecutor displayed copies of the victim files that Agent Rodriguez had shown me months earlier. My personal information, business financial data, psychological assessments, and strategic recommendations filled multiple pages of what looked like a professional consulting report. Marcus Westbrook didn't fall in love with Martha Rodriguez, Prosecutor Williams continued. He studied her like a hunter studies prey, then executed a carefully planned fraud operation, designed to steal everything she had worked to build. The prenuptial agreement that saved her business was the only thing standing between Mrs. Rodriguez and complete financial destruction. She explained how the forged partnership agreement had been created as part of a backup plan, how Marcus had used professional document forgers to create false legal papers that would have given him access to my assets even if the prenup had been enforced. The defendants weren't just criminals, they were criminal innovators who developed new fraud techniques and shared them across their organization to maximize their success rate. The defense attorneys looked overwhelmed as Prosecutor Williams methodically laid out the evidence against their client. Caroline Thompson, Marcus's original divorce lawyer, had withdrawn from the case once the criminal charges were filed, leaving him with a public defender who clearly understood that he was facing an impossible task. Marcus's new attorney, David Goldstein, tried to argue during his opening statement that his client had been manipulated by other family members, that he was a victim of the criminal organization, rather than a willing participant. But the evidence was too comprehensive, too detailed, and too damning for anyone to believe that Marcus had been an unwitting accomplice. "My client made mistakes," Goldstein acknowledged, but he was following patterns of behavior that had been established by previous generations of his family. Marcus Westbrook is as much a victim of this criminal enterprise as the women who were defrauded. The argument fell flat with the jury, who had just seen evidence of Marcus's active participation in creating victim files, forging documents, and coordinating fraud operations with other family members. He wasn't a victim, he was a willing participant in a criminal conspiracy that had destroyed hundreds of lives. Patricia's attorney tried a different approach, arguing that his client had been unaware of the criminal nature of her son's activities and had believed she was helping with legitimate business operations. But Agent Rodriguez's testimony about Patricia's role in victim identification and intelligence gathering demolished that defense within minutes. Mrs. Patricia Westbrook maintained detailed files on potential fraud targets, Agent Rodriguez testified. She attended charity events, social gatherings, and business networking functions specifically to identify wealthy women who could be targeted by her family's fraud operations. She wasn't an innocent bystander, she was the intelligence coordinator for a criminal organization. The agent displayed communication logs, showing Patricia's reports to family members about potential victims she'd identified. Target shows signs of recent financial stress, vulnerable to sympathy approach. Recommend assignment to David for initial contact. Another message read, subject has significant business assets but limited family support, high probability success for long-term operation. Patricia's attorney attempted to cross-examine Agent Rodriguez about the interpretation of these communications, suggesting that they could have been misunderstood or taken out of context. But the agent had hundreds of similar messages, all following the same pattern of victim identification and tactical recommendations. Mrs. Westbrook's communications consistently used language that indicates knowledge of criminal intent. Agent Rodriguez explained terms like target, operation, asset extraction, and subject compliance are not typically used in legitimate business or social contexts. These communications demonstrate systematic criminal planning and coordination. Thomas Kim testified about the financial evidence he'd uncovered during his forensic investigation. He walked the jury through the complex network of shell companies, offshore accounts, and money laundering operations that the family had used to hide their stolen assets. The Westbrook family operated their criminal enterprise with the same level of financial sophistication that legitimate corporations use for international business, Thomas explained. They maintained detailed accounting records, conducted profit and loss analysis, and even filed tax returns on their criminal proceeds to avoid detection by the IRS. He displayed spreadsheets showing how the family had tracked their fraud operations, like business projects. Victim names were replaced with project codes, financial targets were established for each operation, and success rates were calculated to evaluate the effectiveness of different fraud techniques. The family treated crime like a business because, to them, that's exactly what it was, Thomas continued. They had quarterly performance reviews, annual planning sessions, and long-term strategic goals for expanding their criminal operations into new markets and demographics. The financial evidence was overwhelming. Thomas had traced over $47 million in stolen assets through the family's complex money laundering network, identifying the specific victims who had been defrauded and the amounts stolen from each. My case represented less than 2% of the total financial damage, but it had been the key that unlocked the entire investigation. Rebecca Chen, Marcus's first wife, testified about her experience as one of the family's early victims. Her testimony was devastating, not just because of the financial fraud she'd suffered, but because of the elaborate lies the family had created to cover their tracks. I thought my husband was dead, Rebecca said, her voice barely audible in the silent courtroom. For 15 years I believed Marcus had died in a car accident. I grieved for him, I missed him, I built a shrine to his memory in my home. I never knew that he had simply moved on to new victims while I was left with nothing. She described how Marcus had systematically drained her business accounts, forged her signature on loan applications, and stolen her identity to open credit lines that she didn't discover until years later. He didn't just steal my money, he stole my ability to trust anyone ever again. He made me doubt my own judgment about people and relationships. Rebecca's testimony revealed that the family's early fraud operations had been less sophisticated but equally devastating. They'd learned from their mistakes in her case and developed more refined techniques for subsequent victims, including the systematic approach they'd used against me. Marcus told me he loved me, Rebecca continued. He said we were building a life together, that my success was his success, that he wanted to help me grow my business, but he was lying about everything. He was documenting my assets, studying my business operations, and planning to steal everything I owned from the moment we started dating. The defense attorneys struggled to challenge Rebecca's testimony, because the financial evidence supported every aspect of her account. Bank records, forged documents, and digital communications confirmed that Marcus had systematically defrauded her using the same techniques he'd later attempted to use against me. Jennifer Walsh, a forensic psychologist who specialized in fraud investigations, testified about the psychological manipulation techniques the family had used to maintain control over their victim. Her analysis of the family's victim files revealed sophisticated understanding of emotional vulnerabilities and systematic approaches to psychological exploitation. The Westbrook family didn't just steal money, Dr. Walsh explained. They conducted psychological warfare against their victims, systematically breaking down their self-confidence, isolating them from support networks, and creating emotional dependence that made it difficult for victims to recognize they were being defrauded. She displayed excerpts from the family's operational manual that detailed specific psychological manipulation techniques, create artificial emergencies that require immediate financial decisions, isolate subject from family and friends, who might provide alternative perspective, establish financial dependence through joint accounts and shared obligations, maintain emotional control through alternating affection and withdrawal. Dr. Walsh's testimony helped the jury understand that the family's victims weren't naive or gullible. They were targets of sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques that had been developed and refined over decades of criminal experience. The victims of this criminal organization were successful, intelligent women who were systematically deceived by professional criminals, Dr. Walsh continued. The fraud techniques used against them were sophisticated enough to fool mental health professionals, financial advisors, and law enforcement officers. These women were not victims because they lacked intelligence or judgment. They were victims because they were targeted by experts in psychological manipulation. The prosecution called victim after victim to testify about their experiences with different members of the Westbrook family. Each story followed similar patterns: romantic relationships that moved quickly toward financial integration, systematic isolation from support networks, gradual transfer of assets through forged documents and false legal arrangement, and eventual abandonment once the criminals had extracted maximum value. Sarah Martinez testified about losing her house to David Westbrook's fraud scheme. Jennifer Thompson described how Michael Westbrook had destroyed her business partnership through identity theft. Lisa Chen explained how she'd discovered her engagement to Michael was part of a criminal operation, only after she'd lost her savings to fake investment schemes he'd created. Each victim's testimony reinforced the systematic nature of the family's criminal operations and the devastating impact their fraud had on real people's lives. These weren't abstract financial crimes, they were personal betrayals that had destroyed families, ended careers, and shattered victims' ability to trust in human relationships. Kevin Walsh, the document forger who had created the false partnership agreement in my case, testified about his extensive work for the Westbrook family over a 15-year period. His cooperation with federal prosecutors had provided crucial evidence about the family's document fraud operations and their connections to other criminal organizations. The Westbrook family was my best client, Walsh testified. They provided steady work, paid well, and never asked questions about my other criminal activity. I created hundreds of fraudulent documents for them: partnership agreements, marriage certificates, loan applications, insurance policies, even death certificates when they needed to disappear from victims' lives. Walsh explained how the family had provided him with samples of victims' handwriting, detailed specifications for fraudulent documents, and even legal templates that would pass casual inspection by family court judges and financial institutions. They knew exactly what they needed because they'd done this so many times before, Walsh continued. Marcus Westbrook could describe the exact type of partnership agreement that would give him access to his wife's business assets, the specific language that would fool a divorce court, and the precise signatures required to make the forgery believable. The document forger's testimony revealed that my case hadn't been unique. The family had used similar fraudulent partnership agreements against at least 12 other victims over a 20-year period. The technique had been refined through trial and error until it became a standard component of their fraud operations. Agent Rodriguez returned to the witness stand to present evidence about the family's international expansion plans and their connections to similar criminal organizations in other countries. The FBI investigation had uncovered communications with romance fraud networks in Canada, the United Kingdom, and Australia, suggesting that the Westbrook family was attempting to franchise their criminal methods globally. The defendants were planning to export their fraud techniques to criminal organizations in other countries, Agent Rodriguez testified. They had developed training materials, operational procedures, and victim identification protocols that could be adapted for different legal systems and cultural contexts. She displayed communications between Patricia Westbrook and criminal contacts in Toronto and London, discussing potential partnerships and revenue-sharing arrangements for international fraud operations. The family wasn't content with victimizing women in the United States. They were building a global criminal network that could have affected thousands of additional victims. The international expansion evidence demonstrated that the family's criminal ambitions extended far beyond their domestic operations, and that their arrest had potentially prevented romance fraud schemes from spreading to multiple countries. Elena testified about her experience representing me during the divorce proceedings and her discovery of the systematic fraud that had been committed against her client. Her testimony provided the jury with a legal perspective on how the family's criminal operations had been designed to circumvent existing legal protections. The prenuptial agreement that Mrs. Rodriguez insisted on was the only thing that saved her business. Elena explained. Without that document, Marcus Westbrook's fraud scheme would have succeeded, and my client would have lost everything she'd worked to build. But more importantly, that prenuptial agreement created the legal framework that allowed us to identify and expose the systematic fraud. Elena described how the forged partnership agreement had been designed to circumvent the prenup's protections and give Marcus access to my business assets even if the marriage contract was enforced. The defendants had studied family law extensively and developed fraud techniques specifically designed to defeat standard legal protection. Her testimony highlighted how the family's criminal sophistication had evolved to counter legal safeguards that victims might implement to protect themselves. They weren't just committing opportunistic fraud, they were systematically defeating legal protections through criminal innovation. The prosecution's final witness was Dr. Michael Torres, an economist, who had calculated the total financial damage caused by the Westbrook family's criminal enterprise. His analysis went beyond the direct theft of assets to include secondary damages like destroyed credit ratings, lost business opportunities, and the costs of legal proceedings required to resolve the fraud. The total economic impact of this criminal organization exceeds $73 million, Dr. Torres testified. This includes $47 million in directly stolen assets, $18 million in secondary financial damages to victims, and $8 million in law enforcement and legal costs required to investigate and prosecute the conspiracy. His analysis demonstrated that romance fraud created ripple effects that extended far beyond the immediate theft of assets. Victims lost not just their money but their ability to access credit, their business relationships, and their financial stability for years after the initial fraud. The defendants didn't just steal money, Dr. Torres continued. They systematically destroyed their victims' financial lives, creating damage that took years to repair, and in some cases, could never be fully reversed. The defense attorneys made their closing arguments, but they had no effective response to the overwhelming evidence that had been presented. Marcus's attorney continued to argue that his client had been manipulated by other family members, but the jury had seen too much evidence of his active participation in criminal planning and execution. Patricia's attorney tried to portray his client as a loving mother who had been unaware of her family's criminal activities, but Agent Rodriguez's testimony about her role in victim identification and intelligence gathering had demolished that defense. Richard Westbrook's attorney attempted to argue that the real estate business had been legitimate, and that his client's involvement in fraud had been minimal. But Thomas Kim's financial analysis had shown that the business had been primarily a money laundering operation designed to hide criminal proceeds. Prosecutor Williams delivered a closing argument that summarized the massive scope of the criminal enterprise and emphasized the systematic nature of the family's fraud operation. Ladies and gentlemen, over the past 3 weeks, you have heard evidence of one of the most sophisticated and destructive criminal conspiracies in modern American history, she began. The defendants didn't commit crimes of passion or desperation. They built a criminal organization that operated like a business, with systematic victim targeting, standardized fraud procedures, and profit optimization strategies that destroyed hundreds of lives. She reminded the jury of the testimony from victims like Rebecca Chen and Sarah Martinez, emphasizing the personal devastation that the family's crimes had caused. These defendants stole more than money. They stole trust, they stole hope, they stole their victims' ability to believe in love and human decency. Prosecutor Williams concluded by highlighting the role that my prenuptial agreement had played in exposing the conspiracy and bringing the criminals to justice. Martha Rodriguez's courage in protecting herself and fighting back when she discovered the fraud didn't just save her own business. It exposed a criminal organization that might have continued victimizing women for decades. Her prenuptial agreement became the thread that, when pulled, unraveled an entire criminal empire. The jury deliberated for only 6 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all counts against all defendants. Marcus was convicted of conspiracy, fraud, money laundering, and identity theft. Patricia was found guilty of conspiracy and racketeering. Richard was convicted on fraud and money laundering charges. The other family members and associates were convicted on various charges related to their roles in the criminal enterprise. Judge Miller scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks later, but he made some preliminary comments that indicated the severity of the penalties the defendants would face. The evidence in this case reveals criminal conduct that is breathtaking in its scope and devastating in its impact. The defendants operated a criminal organization that systematically destroyed the lives of hundreds of innocent victims over a period of 4 decades. As the defendants were led away in handcuffs, I felt a mixture of relief and satisfaction that justice was finally being served. The confident criminals who had once intimidated me with their wealth and social connections were now facing the consequences of their lifetime of systematic fraud. Agent Rodriguez walked with Elena and me out of the courthouse, and she provided some perspective on what the convictions meant for other victims and for law enforcement's ability to combat similar crimes in the future. This case has changed how federal law enforcement investigates organized romance fraud, she explained. The evidence we gathered and the techniques we developed will be used to identify and prosecute similar criminal organizations across the country. Martha's case has literally rewritten the playbook for fighting these types of crimes. She continued, more importantly, the asset forfeiture in this case will provide full restitution to every identified victim. The defendants will lose everything they own, and that money will be distributed to the people they victimized. This level of victim recovery is unprecedented in organized fraud cases. The media coverage of the convictions was extensive, with news outlets across the country reporting on what many described as the largest romance fraud prosecution in American history. I was interviewed by several national news programs about my experience and the role that the prenuptial agreement had played in exposing the conspiracy. The lesson here isn't that people should be cynical about love or relationships, I told one interview. The lesson is that protecting yourself financially doesn't mean you don't trust your partner. It means you're being responsible about your future security. Real love supports your need to protect yourself. I emphasized that the victims of the Westbrook family's crimes weren't naive or gullible. They were targets of professional criminals who had spent decades perfecting their manipulation techniques. These weren't crimes of opportunity. They were systematic operations conducted by experts in psychological manipulation and financial fraud. The sentencing hearing 6 weeks later brought closure to a case that had consumed more than a year of my life and changed everything I thought I knew about trust, love, and financial security. Judge Miller imposed sentences that reflected the severity of the crimes and the massive scope of the criminal enterprise. Marcus received 22 years in federal prison, plus full restitution requirements that would keep him financially devastated for the rest of his life. Patricia received 18 years for her role in organizing and directing the criminal operations. Richard received 15 years for money laundering and fraud. The other family members and associates received sentences ranging from 8 to 12 years. The defendants in this case operated a criminal organization that destroyed hundreds of lives and stole millions of dollars over a period of 4 decades. Judge Miller said during sentencing, their crimes were not isolated acts of desperation but systematic operations conducted with the cold calculation of professional criminals. He continued, the impact of their crimes extends far beyond the financial losses suffered by their victims. They systematically destroyed their victims' ability to trust in human relationships, to believe in love and commitment, and to feel secure in their own judgment about people. The emotional and psychological damage they inflicted may never be fully repaired. Judge Miller also ordered the forfeiture of all assets owned by the defendants, including real estate holdings, business interests, luxury goods, and offshore accounts. The total value of forfeited assets exceeded $52 million, providing more than enough money to compensate every identified victim for their financial losses. As I watched Marcus being led away to begin his 22-year prison sentence, I felt a sense of closure that I hadn't expected. The confident man who had once made me doubt my own judgment about financial protection was now facing the consequences of a lifetime of systematic crime. The prenuptial agreement that he had dismissed as unromantic and unnecessary had not only protected my business, but had become the foundation for one of the largest organized crime prosecutions in federal history. My refusal to be manipulated out of protecting my assets had ultimately protected hundreds of other victims and changed how law enforcement investigates romance fraud. Elena and Agent Rodriguez joined me for lunch after the sentencing hearing, and we reflected on the broader impact of everything that had been accomplished through the investigation and prosecution. "Martha," Elena said, "what you've achieved here goes far beyond protecting your own business or even exposing this particular criminal conspiracy. You've helped create legal precedents and investigative procedures that will protect other victims for generations to come." Agent Rodriguez agreed, adding that the case had already influenced how federal law enforcement approached organized fraud investigations. "The techniques we developed for analyzing financial networks and identifying criminal organizations are being used in other cases across the country. Your prenuptial agreement didn't just save your business, it became a model for how legal protections can expose criminal conspiracy." The victim restitution program was completed within 6 months of the sentencing, with every identified victim receiving full compensation for their financial losses, plus assistance in repairing credit damage and identity theft issues. The FBI's Victim Services Division had worked with financial institutions and credit reporting agencies to ensure that the fraud's impact on victims' credit histories and financial standings was completely eliminated. Rebecca Chen used her restitution money to rebuild the business that Marcus had destroyed 15 years earlier. Sarah Martinez was able to repurchase the house she'd lost to David Westrook's fraud scheme. Jennifer Thompson reestablished her business partnership and expanded into new markets. Each victim was able to rebuild what the Westrook family had stolen, both financially and emotionally. The case also resulted in significant changes to federal law enforcement procedures and financial industry regulations designed to prevent similar crimes in the future. Banks were required to implement stronger identity verification procedures for joint accounts and business partnerships. Credit reporting agencies developed new systems for detecting identity theft and fraudulent financial activity. Law enforcement agencies established specialized units for investigating organized romance fraud operations. The Westrook family's criminal enterprise was unprecedented in its scope and sophistication, Agent Rodriguez explained, but the investigation we conducted to expose them has created new tools and techniques that will make it much more difficult for similar organizations to operate undetected. The legislative impact extended beyond law enforcement to include new protections for victims of romance fraud and identity theft. Congress passed the Romance Fraud Protection Act, which created federal resources for victim assistance and established new penalties for organized fraud operations. Several states enacted similar legislation providing additional protections and resources for fraud victims. My case had become more than a personal victory over criminal deception. It had become a catalyst for systemic changes that would protect other potential victims for years to come. The prenuptial agreement that Marcus had signed without reading had triggered an investigation that reshaped how America fights organized financial crime. As I reflected on everything that had happened since that morning when Marcus had demanded half of my business in divorce court, I realized that the most important lesson wasn't about legal protection or financial security. It was about trusting your instincts and refusing to be manipulated out of protecting yourself, even when people you love try to convince you that protection isn't necessary. The prenup hadn't just saved my business, it had validated my judgment and proven that my instincts about financial self-protection had been correct all along. Marcus and his family had spent months trying to convince me that legal protection was unromantic, unnecessary and insulting to our relationship. But they'd been wrong about everything, and my refusal to listen to their manipulation had ultimately exposed their criminal conspiracy and brought justice to hundreds of victims. Real love doesn't ask you to make yourself vulnerable to financial destruction. Real love supports your need to protect yourself and respects your right to maintain your independence and security. The people who pressure you to abandon your protection are the ones you most need protection from. Marcus had signed that prenuptial agreement without reading it because he'd been too arrogant to believe it would ever matter. Too confident in his criminal abilities to think he could be exposed and prosecuted. But his arrogance had been his downfall, and my insistence on protecting myself had been his undoing. The document that was supposed to protect my business had become the thread that, when pulled, unraveled one of the largest criminal conspiracies in modern American history. And in doing so, it had proven that sometimes the best way to protect yourself is simply to refuse to be talked out of your own good judgment. 5 years have passed since that November morning when Marcus and his family were sentenced to decades in federal prison, and my life has transformed in ways I never could have imagined when I first walked into that divorce courtroom with nothing but a prenuptial agreement and the determination to protect what I'd built. Rodriguez Digital Marketing has grown beyond anything I dreamed possible during those dark months when I thought I might lose everything. We now operate offices in 6 cities, employ over 200 people, and have become the go-to agency for entrepreneurs and small business owners who want marketing strategies that actually deliver results. The criminal investigation that threatened to destroy my company ultimately freed it from the sabotage and interference that had been holding it back for years. Without Marcus's manipulation and his family's attempts to undermine my business relationships, Rodriguez Digital Marketing flourished in ways that revealed just how much damage their criminal activities had been causing. Clients who had been hesitant to sign long-term contracts suddenly became eager partners. Business relationships that had felt strained and difficult became smooth and productive. Revenue streams that had been mysteriously unreliable became consistent and growing. I hired Rebecca Chen as our chief financial officer 2 years ago, and her experience as both a business owner and a fraud victim has brought invaluable perspective to our operation. She developed financial security protocols that protect not just our company, but also our clients from the types of sophisticated fraud schemes that destroyed both our lives. Together, we've created a business environment where trust is earned through transparency and verified through systems, not just assumed through relationships. The Martha Rodriguez Foundation for Financial Security Education has become one of the most respected victim advocacy organizations in the country. We provide educational resources, legal assistance, and emotional support for people who have been targeted by romance fraud and financial manipulation. Our workshops on financial self-protection have been attended by thousands of people across dozens of states, and our online resources have reached victims and potential victims around the world. Sarah Martinez runs our Victim Services Division, using her own experience with fraud recovery to help other women rebuild their financial lives and their confidence in their own judgment. Jennifer Thompson manages our legal advocacy programs, working with legislators and law enforcement agencies to strengthen protections against organized fraud operations. Lisa Chen heads our background verification services, helping people conduct thorough investigations of potential romantic partners before they become vulnerable to manipulation. The foundation has helped recover over $12 million in stolen assets for fraud victims who weren't part of the original Westbrook investigation. We've assisted in prosecuting 17 additional romance fraud operations, and our educational programs have prevented countless other people from becoming victims of similar schemes. The work we do honors not just our own experiences, but the experiences of every person who has been betrayed by someone they trusted with their heart and their financial security. My personal life has found a balance that I never experienced during my marriage to Mark. I've dated, I've traveled, I've built deep friendships with people who value honesty and authenticity over manipulation and control. I learned to distinguish between genuine affection and calculated charm, between real support and strategic positioning, between love that empowers and attention that seeks to exploit. 2 years ago, I met Dr. James Patterson, a forensic psychologist who specializes in helping fraud victims recover from the emotional trauma of systematic manipulation. Our relationship developed slowly, built on honest communication and mutual respect for each other's independence and security needs. When he proposed 6 months ago, the first thing he suggested was that we both have independent legal representation to draft a comprehensive prenuptial agreement that would protect both of our assets and business interests. That conversation felt like the most romantic thing anyone had ever said to me, not because it was unromantic, but because it demonstrated that James understood and supported my need to protect myself. Real love doesn't ask you to make yourself vulnerable to financial destruction. Real love supports your wisdom, respects your experience, and encourages you to maintain the independence and security that make you strong and confident. Our prenuptial agreement is 27 pages of detailed financial protections, asset classifications, and business security measures. We both reviewed every paragraph with our own attorneys. We both asked difficult questions about every provision, and we both signed it with full understanding of exactly what we were agreeing to. It's not unromantic, it's the foundation of a relationship built on honesty, transparency, and mutual respect for each other's financial independence. James understands that my experience with Marcus wasn't just a bad marriage, it was a systematic criminal victimization that taught me invaluable lessons about protecting myself and trusting my instincts. He's never asked me to be less careful, less protective, or less independent. Instead, he's supported my advocacy work, contributed his own expertise to our foundation's programs, and helped me understand that healthy relationships are built on respect for boundaries, not the elimination of them. The legal precedents established through the Westbrook prosecution continue to influence how federal law enforcement investigates organized fraud operations. Agent Rodriguez, now promoted to head the FBI's Romance Fraud Task Force, regularly consults with me about new cases and investigative techniques. The methods developed during our investigation have been used to expose and prosecute dozens of other criminal organizations, protecting thousands of potential victims from financial manipulation and emotional betrayal. Thomas Kim left his private practice to join the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, where he specializes in the type of forensic analysis that exposed the Westbrook family's criminal enterprise. His techniques for tracing digital financial networks and identifying systematic fraud patterns have become standard procedures in federal investigation. The skills he developed while investigating my case have helped recover over $200 million in stolen assets for victims of various fraud schemes. Elena has become one of the most sought-after family law attorneys in the region, particularly for cases involving financial fraud and asset protection. Her experience with my case taught her to recognize the warning signs of systematic manipulation and to implement legal protections that can expose criminal activity before it succeeds. She's helped dozens of other clients discover and prosecute fraud attempts that might have otherwise succeeded. The Westbrook family members remain in federal prison, with Marcus still serving his 22-year sentence and Patricia serving her 18-year term. None of them have expressed remorse for their crimes or acknowledgement of the damage they inflicted on their victim. Their continued defiance validates everything I learned about their character during the investigation. They were career criminals who saw their victims as opportunities, not people deserving of empathy or respect. Jessica, Marcus's former secretary who had been positioned as his next victim, used the information she provided to prosecutors to build a new career in fraud prevention and victim advocacy. She works with financial institutions to identify and prevent romance fraud schemes, using her insider knowledge of criminal techniques to protect other potential targets. Her experience demonstrated that even people who appear to be accomplices in fraud operations may actually be victims themselves, targeted and manipulated by professional criminals. The international expansion of romance fraud prevention has become a significant focus of law enforcement cooperation. The techniques and procedures developed during the Westbrook investigation have been shared with police agencies in Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, and 12 other countries where similar criminal organizations have been identified. The global impact of our case continues to grow as more international fraud networks are exposed and prosecuted. Rodriguez digital marketing has become a case study in business schools and entrepreneurship programs, not just for our growth and success, but for the security protocols we've developed to protect businesses from internal and external fraud threats. We consult with other companies about implementing financial safeguards, employee verification procedures, and operational transparency measures that can prevent the types of systematic infiltration that the Westbrook family used against their victim. The prenuptial agreement that started this entire journey sits framed in my office, not as a trophy but as a reminder of the importance of trusting your instincts and protecting yourself even when other people try to convince you that protection isn't necessary. It's signed by a man who spent months trying to manipulate me out of my own good judgment, who dismissed my concerns as unromantic and unnecessary, who ultimately went to prison for 22 years because he underestimated my determination to maintain my independence and security. That document didn't just save my business, it exposed a criminal conspiracy that had operated for 4 decades and victimized hundreds of women across multiple states. It triggered an investigation that changed how America fights organized fraud and created legal protections that will benefit victims for generations to come. It proved that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply refuse to be talked out of protecting yourself. The lesson I've learned through this experience isn't that people should be cynical about love or suspicious of every romantic relationship. The lesson is that genuine love supports your need to be careful, respects your right to maintain your independence, and encourages you to trust your own judgment about protecting your financial security. The people who pressure you to abandon your protections are often the ones you most need protection from. Marcus signed that prenuptial agreement without reading it, because he thought it didn't matter, because he believed his criminal schemes would circumvent any legal protections I might have, because he was too arrogant to imagine that his lies could be exposed and prosecuted. But his arrogance became his downfall, and my insistence on protecting myself became the foundation for justice that reached far beyond my own case. Today, as I prepare for my wedding to James next month, I'm grateful for every difficult lesson I learned through my experience with Marcus and his criminal family. Those lessons taught me to value my own judgment, to insist on my right to protection, and to build relationships based on honesty and transparency rather than manipulation and control. They taught me that real strength comes not from being invulnerable but from being smart enough to protect yourself when vulnerability is required. The prenup that Marcus dismissed as unromantic became the most romantic thing I ever signed, not because it was romantic in itself, but because it represented my commitment to valuing myself enough to insist on protection, even when people I loved tried to convince me that protection wasn't necessary. It became the foundation for everything I've built since: a thriving business, meaningful advocacy work, and a new relationship based on mutual respect and shared commitment to each other's independence and security. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.